Folks, I'm opening our episode today with a problem that is very, let's say, complex. Way back in 1961, way before we had 8-track players for our cars, let alone access to the World Wide Web from devices that we hold in the palm of our hands, Dwight D. Eisenhower was already warning us that America could become, quote, the captive of a scientific technological elite, end quote. He feared that public policy would be unduly influenced by the rise of the military industrial complex, a finely tuned collaboration where businesses that profit from the war machine use lobbyists and campaign contributions to influence politicians and convince them to support international conflicts, and to allocate more and more taxpayer money for military spending. Well, folks, now we have the modern iteration of the military industrial complex, the censorship industrial complex, where, in an age where information is both a tool and a weapon, we now see an intertwining network of government agencies, academic institutions, and non governmental organizations colluding with social media giants and tech innovators to shape the contours of public discourse. Again, using taxpayer money to finance their endeavors. This brand new industrial complex is not about using money to secure power and make more money. Instead, it's about swaying opinions and mindsets. And to what end? Well, I'm convinced that the ultimate goal of the censorship industrial complex is indeed to secure power and make more money. Before we examine the actual motives, let's first look at who they are and where they came from. The seeds of today's censorship industrial complex were planted in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, when America launched its war on terror, an undertaking to open the doors for the creation and utilization of tools and legislation to surveil the citizens of these United States, under the broad banner of, quote, combating terrorism, end quote. From the very beginning, said tools and legislation, for example, the Patriot Act, have been misused in a multitude of ways and are now being repurposed by the censorship industrial complex. Another national crisis that has led to the rise of the censorship industrial complex is a growing need to address the rampant spread of, quote, misinformation online. A huge catalyst for vamping up internet censorship was a highly exaggerated claim that foreign entities, Russia, were using bots and social media to interfere in the 2016 election. And then there's the problem of domestic fringe organizations using the internet to spread messages of radical ideology. You might recall a recent episode of Save America where we examined the insanity of QAnon and similar right-wing organizations and the potential damage they can do to our country. This is the legitimate concern about the messaging people are exposed to when they go online. But the censorship industrial complex is not interested in targeting extremism and true threats to our nation. Michael Schellenberger is an author, a political candidate, and the president and founder of the nonprofit organization Environmental Progress. This seems like an odd set of credentials for a person who has recently become a leading advocate for destroying the censorship industrial complex. But I suspect that Schellenberger's passion for the subject is a direct result of his controversial opinions on environmentalism. I'm guessing that his personal contributions on social media platforms have been widely censored. But again, this is only speculation on my part. Whatever the case may be, Schellenberger and a colleague testified about the evolution of the censorship industrial complex to the House Select Committee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government in March 2023. Schellenberger defines the censorship industrial complex as a network of ideologically aligned governmental, NGO, and academic institutions that discovered over the last few years the power of censorship to protect their interests against the volatility and risks of the democratic process. They are not defending democracy as they claim. Rather, they are defending their own policy and pecuniary interest against democracy. You see, unlike the traditional defense alliances that build armaments, the censorship industrial complex crafts digital tools designed to control the narrative on issues as varied as pandemic policies, election integrity, and social identity debates. By nudging the public discourse, framing selective theories, and amplifying certain messages while suppressing others, these entities can guide the conversation without the overt appearance of censorship. They are psychological manipulation and cutting-edge computer science tools to create a formidable mechanism of control that extends well beyond the simple silencing of dissenting voices. It is a system that employs military-grade monitoring and speech-countering techniques, including artificial intelligence, traditionally reserved for combating terrorism and extremism, but now repurposed to engage with what is deemed misinformation spread by ordinary U.S. citizens. This marks a profound shift in the scope and scale of censorship, expanding the battlefield to the very heart of public discourse and private conversation. The utilization of such advanced techniques for the purpose of countering misinformation without a clear and present danger to national security raises significant ethical and legal questions. It reflects a departure from the reactive measures of the past to a proactive stance, where potential threats to the narrative are neutralized before they can even gain traction. This approach, while arguably effective in curtailing the spread of harmful misinformation, also opens the door to abuses of power, where the distinction between misinformation and inconvenient truth becomes blurred by subjective interpretation and political expedience. It is a system that, in its supposed quest to protect, often ends up perpetuating harm, diluting the vigor of public discourse, infringing on individual liberties, and ultimately undermining the democratic process itself. If the information landscape is manipulated, can the decisions made by the populace truly be said to be their own? This represents a fundamental challenge to the principles of democratic governance, where informed consent and the free exchange of ideas are essential for legitimacy and accountability. The repercussions of such a system are, well, profound. By restricting the flow of information and ideas, we impoverish our collective understanding and hinder our ability to tackle complex societal challenges. The diversity of thought is essential for innovation, resilience, and social cohesion. When voices are silenced, we all suffer from the loss of potential solutions, insights, and understandings that could have contributed to the betterment of our society. Whether they are correct or incorrect, Americans have a right to express their ideas. Freedom of speech is important to personal autonomy and dignity. It acknowledges that individuals are capable of thinking for themselves, of discerning truth from falsehood, and of making moral judgments. To curtail this right is to treat citizens not as autonomous agents, but as subjects to be guided and controlled. It is a diminution of the individual's intrinsic value and a denial of their capacity for reason. This fundamental principle is enshrined in the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, serving as a bedrock upon which the edifice of American democracy is built. It is a testament to the belief that the marketplace of ideas is self-correcting, that through the clash and clamor of debate, the truth will emerge and society will advance. The principle of free speech demands not just tolerance for dissenting and unpopular voices, but a commitment to engage with them. It requires courage to defend the speech of those with whom we disagree most vehemently, understanding that the test of our commitment to freedom of speech lies not in our willingness to defend the ideas we agree with, but in our readiness to support the rights of those who express ideas that we find outright objectionable. Moreover, the application of military-grade monitoring techniques to the realm of public discourse raises serious concerns about privacy and civil liberties. In a society under constant surveillance, where every word can be monitored and potentially used to counter dissent, the chilling effect on free speech cannot be overstated. The knowledge that one's speech is subject to such scrutiny can lead to self-censorship, stifling the free expression that is the lifeblood of a vibrant democratic society. The rise of the censorship industrial complex is not just a problem here in the United States. From the halls of power in Washington to the streets of Berlin, from the academic institutions of Ireland to the digital landscapes of Mexico, laws and policies are being enacted that stifle speech and stymie dissent. While the intention to create a safer and more inclusive society is commendable, such laws have, in practice, been wielded to silence political dissent and suppress minority viewpoints. In some countries, these laws have been used to prosecute journalists, activists, and even citizens for expressing criticism against governmental policies or societal norms, thus eroding the bedrock of democratic engagement. The idea that a so-called censorship industrial complex is interfering so heavy-handedly in the discourse of average Americans sounds very much like one of the conspiracy theories that such a system purports to protect us from. But according to Michael Schellenberger, it's all very real. In his testimony, he outlines the extent of the problem, and he calls out the key organizations, academic institutions, and individuals that have been identified as being involved in shady censorship campaigns, revealing the vast amounts of taxpayer money that has been handed out to support such efforts. Look, we obviously don't have time to list out every example of censorship collaboration included in Schellenberger's testimony, so I'm going to highlight only the one that hits closest to home for a Seattleite. He reports that the University of Washington partnered with the Department of Homeland Security to censor information on social media platforms during the 2020 election. Then, in 2021, the University of Washington shared a $3 million grant from the Biden administration with Stanford Internet Observatory, so both universities can continue their work flagging what was deemed election misinformation. When light was first shed on the practices of the censorship industrial complex, the entities involved, tech companies and their academic partners, defended their actions as exercises of their First Amendment rights, purportedly in defense of democracy itself. Yet, documents unearthed from the U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, through the Functional Government Initiative, reveal a different tale. These documents showcase a symbiosis between academia, tech firms, and government officials far more intimate than previously acknowledged, with committee members often acting in capacities that blurred the lines between private and governmental roles. The Cybersecurity Advisory Committee, charged with combating mis, dis, and malinformation, engaged in discussions that would not be out of place in a dystopian novel, debating the merits of quote-unquote social listening and establishing metrics for successful censorship. Initially created to counter foreign misinformation efforts, CISA's focus ominously shifted to domestic threats, with strategies devised not just for foreign misinformation, but for any narrative that diverged from the government line, regardless of the truth's inconvenience. The stance on malinformation, which is defined as truthful information that contradicts preferred narratives, was particularly revealing. The reluctance to acknowledge such information as legitimate discourse underscores a disturbing readiness to sideline truth for narrative control, raising profound questions about the commitment to democratic principles. The discussions ventured into areas such as combating dangerously inaccurate health advice, with involvement from agencies like the FBI and Homeland Security to tackle domestic threats. Yet there was an acute awareness of the limitations and potential backlash, reminiscent of the outcry that led to the swift disbandment of President Biden's Disinformation Governance Board. In efforts to avoid similar fates, the committee went to great lengths to sanitize their language and seek allies within progressive circles, aiming to cushion their work in palatable terms. This maneuvering-seeking, partnership by support, veiling intentions, and obscure the nature of their involvement paints a grim picture of a committee more concerned with maintaining a narrative than fostering a truly informed democracy. As we navigate this new landscape of censorship, it begs the question, in whose hands does the truth lie? And at what point does the pursuit of a safe narrative threaten the democratic fabric it claims to protect? Schellenberger's proposed solution for quelling the rise of the censorship industrial complex is to compel our government to enact legislation that will protect the voices of the American people. He says, and I quote, Congress should immediately cut off funding to the censors and investigate their activities. Second, it should mandate instant reporting of all conversations between social media executives, government employees, and contractors concerning content moderation. Third, Congress should limit the broad permission given to social media platforms to censor, deplatform, and spread propaganda. Here at Crusade America, we agree with these three edicts, but with some reservation. Of course, we would love for our government to cease funding the efforts to silence dissenting voices. But will they agree to stop after being so complicit for so very long? We must acknowledge that it is in the politicians' best interest to influence public discourse, and trusting our government to put its own interests aside is, well, never a strong bet. This brings us to Schellenberger's second demand about mandated reporting of conversations surrounding mass censorship. He is correct that the fight for free speech and a free society is not just about resisting overt acts of suppression, it's also about challenging the subtle and sophisticated mechanisms of control that operate in the shadows. By advocating for transparency and accountability, we can strive to bring nefarious practices out of the darkness and into the light, where public scrutiny can apply pressure to the wrongdoers. However, it seems impossible to enforce a policy of mandated reporting of private conversations. So, frankly, I don't know how that workable transparency legislation would look like or work. As for limiting the rights of social media platforms to censor content, this could and should very carefully be done. In confronting the challenges posed by the censorship industrial complex, it is crucial to strike a balance between the legitimate need to counter misinformation and the imperative to preserve freedom of speech and privacy. This requires a reevaluation of the tools and techniques employed in this endeavor, ensuring that they are used judiciously and with respect for the fundamental rights and liberties that define a free and democratic society. It also necessitates a dialogue between government, technology companies, civil society, and the public to establish clear guidelines and oversight mechanisms that safeguard against overreach and abuse. We must advocate for policies that ensure accountability within both governmental and private sectors, demanding clear criteria for content moderation, the right to appeal decisions, and the involvement of independent oversight to guard against bias and overreach. Look, friends, we've said this before in our show, but it bears repeating, that the most effective yet equally elusive solution for combating misinformation online would be to forge a population that is able to self-regulate. The cultivation of digital literacy is paramount, empowering individuals to critically assess information, discern bias, and navigate the complexities of the modern information landscape with discernment and resilience. We must also look inward, challenging ourselves to engage with opposing viewpoints using empathy and respect. The antidote to misinformation and extremism is not censorship, but open dialogue. By fostering an environment where ideas can be debated on their merits, we nurture a culture of understanding and mutual respect, which again are the cornerstones of a healthy democracy. In summary, the emergence of the censorship industrial complex represents one of the most formidable challenges to our democratic institutions in the contemporary era. Yet within this challenge lies a profound opportunity. An opportunity to reaffirm our commitment to the principles of freedom, to strengthen the foundation of our democracies, and to ensure that the marketplace of ideas remains open and vibrant for future generations. Let us seize this moment, not with trepidation, but with courage and conviction that the fight for free speech is a noble and essential pursuit. As we move forward, let us draw inspiration from the tireless advocates of free speech who have come before us, from the philosophers who laid the groundwork of liberal democracy, to the activists who have fought for civil rights and liberties around the globe. Their legacy reminds us that the right to speak freely is not granted without struggle, nor maintained without vigilance. When we protect our right to free speech, we safeguard not just our present, but also secure the promise of our future, ensuring that the flame of freedom and the spirit of open discourse continue to illuminate our path. And that, my friends, is the last word up front. I'm Sean Sainhart, and this is Coup Save America. Our guest today is here to tell us about a secret and enraging form of online censorship that is happening every day to people like you and me. We don't even know it. Robert Hawkins is a social entrepreneur and founder of RevEdit, a website that shows people where they have been censored. Robert became passionate about restoring free speech values online after discovering his own comments from the past years have been secretly removed. And he is here to blow the whistle on a practice known as shadow banning. And Robert joins us right after the break. This is Coup Save America. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Sorry about that, folks. Okay, let's bring in our guest. Robert, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me, Sean. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you about how to save America from the complexities of censorship.
Yeah, it's quite amazing that we're at this point, and the involvement of nonprofit organizations, social media companies, and the government. I mean, this is really collusion at a dystopian level, is it not?
Yes, yeah. So maybe just jumping off from your comments about Michael Schellenberger's reporting, I would say that I agree with him about the scale of the problem. It's absolutely massive. In my opinion, almost every social media or internet user has probably been moderated or censored at some point without their knowledge. I just think it's important to recognize that it's not just government who's censoring. We also censor each other, and that's what's known as shadow banning, but it can also be person to person, not just platform or government to individual.
No, I have to admit, I've heard shadow banning. I've heard that term many times. I'm not clear as to what it is. Can you explain what shadow banning is and how it kind of manifests?
Absolutely. Yeah. So shadow banning is just when the platform doesn't tell you it moderated you and actively hides that from you. So, for example, you write a comment online, a moderator removes it, you don't receive any notification. And crucially, when you go back and look at your comment while you're logged in, the system shows you your comment as if it has not been removed. Nobody else can see it. This is different from transparent content moderation, where the system alerts you to actions taken against you. With shadow bans, there's no alert and you're shown a false status of your content. The only way you're going to discover it is by logging out and checking, or maybe checking with another username. Although sometimes the platforms make that difficult too. For example, Facebook's hide comment button will hide your comment from everyone except you and your friends. Most people never discover when this happens, and it causes all kinds of problems, which is why I wanted to raise awareness of the practice, which so far I think has largely gone unchallenged.
And so your website is specifically targeted to Reddit. Is that correct?
Yes, my website just works with Reddit, but Reddit has over 400 million monthly active users. And so it is significant in the social media landscape.
Oh, absolutely. And I was surprised to learn that Reddit, which has a perhaps false reputation of being open-minded and a platform that encourages active discourse and debate.
Yeah, they've even submitted a brief to the Supreme Court in Google versus Gonzalez, I think, which was a case that was heard last year, in which they said in their brief that it was a place where users could go to practice their freedom of expression. So that is how they hold themselves out. Of course, in their terms somewhere, I'm sure it's in fine print that they are permitted to remove content without notification. But yeah, they certainly have advertised being a place where users could express themselves freely.
Yeah, I've seen across multiple, like on Twitter and Facebook. I don't use Reddit that often, but I've seen people will post comments saying, "Can you see this? Am I being shadow banned?" And I've never understood what that actually meant. Who is actually behind this shadow banning? And what's the? I don't understand the intent behind it. Why not just notify the users that their comment has been removed or suppressed?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a little bit hard to put your finger on who's behind it, because it happens on all of the platforms, and actually the platforms give users the power to do it to each other.
Can you explain that a little bit more as to how that happens?
Yeah. So on Reddit, there are something like 100,000 active communities. And I saw a post once where one moderator tried to calculate how many moderators there were. From a few years ago, it was over 70,000. And they all have the ability. I mean, this is how all comment removals work on Reddit. Your removed comment is still shown to you as if it's not removed. So any comment that they remove is essentially a shadow removal. Now, they can choose to notify you that they removed your comment. But in my experience, and in my experience hearing from users who've used my tool, that's not the norm. So most of the time, there is no notification. It happens on Reddit. And then, on your own Facebook wall as well, you could, maybe your Uncle Joe writes a political comment on your Facebook post, and you don't want people to fight on your page, so you hide his comment. That way, other people won't see it, and Uncle Joe won't come after you for removing it because he doesn't know you removed it. There the impact seems small, but you take that same tool and use it in the form of a political campaign to weed out criticism of your favorite candidate. All of a sudden, you can make it look like everyone agrees with you with whatever you want by simply removing viewpoints that don't align with your own. And maybe this is just a theory, but maybe that becomes easier and easier over time as you sort of curate what people are seeing and maybe what they're even thinking. So the problem there is suddenly more apparent. For users, we're no longer able to effectively engage with our political opponents because everybody is seemingly addicted to these forums where we think we have free speech. But and at the same time, there's no technical difference in doing that 10,000 times in these important political forums, and just one time to your uncle. On a technical level, it's the same thing.
Are we seeing shadow banning applied specifically to political discourse, or are we seeing it in other areas as well?
It's everything. It's it's about money and power, like you said in your intro. This really, if you don't know that you've been moderated on a platform, you're likely to stay in place there, right? So that benefits whoever's in control of that forum. Maybe they have a certain message they want people to believe in, or if it's the platform, you don't go to another platform because you think that this is the place for open discussion, and so they just grow their user base that way.
Yeah, it's really nefarious when you think about it, and it is very counterintuitive to democracy. And in this polarized political climate, discourse is absolutely essential. And the various forms of censorship that we're seeing is, I would say, more dangerous than the political discourse that we're seeing on the mainstream media. That's very divisive and just completely dividing the country in ways that I don't think anybody could have ever imagined at one point. And critics, I guess, will say, well, we're fighting misinformation. We got to fight misinformation. But that's not the case. That's not what they're doing at all, is it?
No, they for the justification for shadow bans, they don't say they use shadow bans to fight misinformation. That's the line that's given for just content moderation in general. Like, oh, we need to remove it. They don't, for shadow banning, the justification is we need it for spam or for trolls, persistent bad faith actors. And I can get into why those arguments don't hold water, but that's their justification. It's not about misinformation.
So how would it help with spam? I mean, if someone is spamming the system, that would be a violation of the terms of agreement for that service. Why not just suspend the user? Why do the shadow banning?
Yeah, that is the question, isn't it, Sean? So platforms say that they need shadow bans to deal with spam, but that's misleading because shadow bans don't fool bots. CAPTCHAs fool bots. I'm a programmer. I can tell you it's easy to write a bot that checks the status of its own content. Once I figure that out, my bot's ability to create content is going to far exceed any human's ability to create content. So you can think of bots as like a sophisticated advertiser. The advertiser is so dedicated that they wrote a program to advertise their message for them. And since bots are basically advertisers, they're very likely to be monitoring the reach of their messaging. So if a platform uses secrecy to restrict their content, bots are likely to discover the secrecy. Real humans, on the other hand, can go years without discovering their secretly removed content. And I share examples of users' reactions on RevEdit's homepage. So the platform's explanation that they need shadow bans to address spam created by bots does not add up, which provides, but this justification has even made it into, for example, Europe's Digital Services Act, where they give exceptions for notification of quote unquote spam. It's a different story when it comes to the volunteer moderators who manage pages on these platforms. They tend to argue more for reducing their workload. The idea being if they tell someone they've been moderated, then that person is going to complain, and that takes up more of their time. But that's not an argument that generally makes it or has reached the public. Yeah, obviously. But there is research that shows that when users know their content has been removed, the odds of them having a future post removed are actually reduced, maybe because they're learning the rules. So I think shadow bans actually increase moderators' workload over time. But the argument that they make is that it causes them more work.
Who are these volunteer moderators? Are they are they associated directly with social media networks, or are they just sort of users that have gained special status?
It's like users that have gained special status. So you could go on Reddit right now and sign up to be a moderator of a forum. Like I said, your own Facebook wall has the ability to hide comments of your family and friends. YouTube comment removals. If you have a YouTube video up and you're the creator of that page, if you click remove on a comment that a subscriber posts on your page, it still appears to them as if it's not removed. So that's a shadow removal. That's a shadow ban, right? So it's really all of us. And there's even another forum that will do this on just based on user reports. So one forum that's grown in popularity recently, I've seen a few organizations set it up, is called Mighty Networks. If you look at their documentation of how it works, one part says, quote, when content is reported by 2 or more members, it's automatically hidden everywhere in the network for all hosts and members, except for the creator of the content who still sees it, so they don't realize it has been hidden.
And as a programmer, I'm sure you can attest that it's not that difficult to set up an automated system that would automatically alert users, hey, your content has been flagged and suppressed for whatever reasons, and here's the process of appeals. You mentioned that the volunteer moderators claim, well, that's just too time consuming. My argument would be, well, then you shouldn't be a moderator. You shouldn't have signed up for this job if you're trying to avoid work. But why not have an automated system? I mean, and again, I guess these questions are kind of at the root of the problem because no one's answering them. The people in charge are not giving us any guidance or feedback as to why they're doing these practices. But it just seems ridiculous that you would manipulate users to thinking that their content is online when it's actually been removed to everybody else. So I mean, would it not be simple to have a system that's automated to just let people know, hey, your content has been removed?
Yeah, I don't think it's burdensome for the platforms to show users the same view of their content that moderators receive. Of course, moderators can see what they have removed, right? So you just flip a switch and show that to the authors of the content. I generally support transparent content moderation where authors are informed of the removal. Some people are against, platforms' right to do that. I just think the secret removal stuff where even the author of content isn't informed of the removal is the unethical aspect.
Right, because you have no right to appeal. Well, I mean, even when you are aware, like when YouTube, for example, or I've seen Twitter do this as well, where they'll remove content and you won't be given a reason as to why. YouTube is notorious for doing this. And you try to appeal the decision and you get nowhere. I mean, so when you're shadow banned, you don't even have the ability to appeal a decision. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the whole idea. I think often in the public conversation now conflates shadow banning with what I call transparent content moderation. But yeah, you're exactly right that the shadow part of it means that you don't even know that you're being punished. It's like being in a authoritarian country where you can't open a bank account and they don't tell you why.
What is some of the most absurd content removal that you've seen?
Oh, it's just everything. Whatever the moderators don't want you to see, and you can imagine what that looks like for a political forum. If it's say the topic is abortion and you're in a conservative forum, okay, then the pro-abortion folks they're going to have their comments removed, and if you're in like atheist forum, then the pro-life comments are going to be removed. and they just don't tell the users that. So you really, when you don't stand up against this practice, you lose the ability to challenge your political adversary online.
Well, and you also put yourself into an echo chamber where you're just echoing back your own sentiments. You're not
But as a
getting any
user,
healthy discourse.
So if you don't know about this and you're just a user, I would say you're innocent. This is true. You are putting yourself into an echo chamber, but you might not know it. But if you do know about this practice and you think that this is the right way to advance democracy by censoring people, I would just ask those people to think twice.
Well, right. Censorship, I mean, I'm sort of a free speech absolutist in terms of, unless something is threatening somebody's life or posing a significant danger to an individual, I see very little reason to be censoring people to start with. I mean, the marketplace of ideas is essential to a functioning democracy. And let me ask you, when did this shadow banning start? Do you know?
Oh, yeah. So I think it's been going on since like the 80s. I've done some research to try to
Really?
find the origins. Yeah. So I think it's just kind of coalesced into today's platforms. So there's some old posts on the internet where people try to dig up when this started. If you really look into it, there's like a Vice article about this, and I wrote a post on my newsletter about it at removednews.com. So yeah, it's been there for a long time, but maybe it just took a while for us all to get online where it started to become such a massive problem. Because now really, everybody is using the internet as a primary means of communication.
Would you say that it's safe to assume that everybody at one point has been shadow banned?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So it's that pervasive.
Yeah, it's that pervasive. On my site, I've got a button that takes you to a random Reddit user. And so you can open that in like 10 tabs. And in my experience, 9 out of 10 times, you're going to find somebody with a removed comment in their history. It looks up on the first page, just has the first 100 comments. And 9 out of 10 of those are going to show some removed comment. And in my experience, most of the time, the moderators don't notify users of the removal for reasons we already discussed.
Wow. I mean, that's just astounding that this is so pervasive and people are just completely unaware that this is happening. If someone suspects that their content has been shadow banned and they use your tool, your website, WebEdit, and they realize that they well, first off, how does your system work? How does your system identify somebody who has been shadow banned?
Okay, so I think the best way to explain this is just to think about anything that you do in public leaves a trail. And I could try to explain it on a technical level, but I'd probably lose you because that's been my experience in the past. But Reddit is completely public, so you can, with a browser extension, you can just track what comments you posted. And then if it gets removed, you're just using the extension to compare what it looks like when you're logged in and then what it looks like to other people when they're logged out, because the logged out view will show you the public view. Does that make sense?
Okay, yeah, I kind of understand now. Yeah, I mean, I'm not very technical, so this is sort of goes over my head. But now, so basically, when you're logged into a platform, it's identified as content that's still up and published. And if you're logged out, you don't see that content.
That's right. Yep. Even at the API level. So there's no difference for you when you're logged in. If your comment gets removed, there's no way for you to find out unless you log out and check. And most people don't do that because they think, these are trustworthy platforms. In fact, I have a theory that most of the people who are sort of mediators who can who try to speak to both sides, or maybe that's all of us to some extent, it kind of cuts out that part of you because the the people who have like a lot of violations, for example, like criminals, just thinking not about the internet, but just thinking about society in general. Like criminals are pretty good at picking locks, right? Or they know when the cops are driving by or whatever. Whereas people who are not committing crimes are not going to be as familiar with police tactics or be concerned about how advanced their lock is. So yeah, I think this practice does the exact opposite of what platforms and moderators claim that it does. They claim it helps deal with spam and trolls. I think it benefits automated spam and trolls, because they're going to be the first ones who figure out that how it works, because they're more often the violators, right? They're going to get dinged more times, and the more times you get secretly dinged, the less interaction you get from other people. So the more likely it is that you discover this mechanism.
So let's say that somebody, I go to your website and I discover that I've been shadow banned. What recourse do I have at that point, now that I'm aware of it?
So when people on my site discover that they've been shadow banned, typically what I see is they will either change their behavior, follow the rules, write to other users about what's going on, perhaps write to the moderators and just ask, like, hey, why did this get removed? Or yeah, they might move to another forum. So something changes, right? But when they don't know, basically they don't learn the rules, they don't move to other forums, and they're just kind of stuck in place.
Well, are these people actually breaking the rules? It sounds like this is just very much kind of on a whim.
Yeah, and I think that's more true when the punishments are kept secret, right?
Right.
Because there's no oversight. What the rules are is, we in government, at least, we think of that as a whole separate specialization. We have, the judicial branch for that. They interpret the rules. They don't write the rules. But the way it is online, the moderators have all of these powers. They write the rules, they interpret the rules, and they enforce the rules. So it's this consolidation that's concerning, and yeah, it's completely secret.
Now, yeah, this is just amazing to me. I'm almost speechless, because it's appalling to think that this discourse online is being censored to the degree that it is. And
yeah, maybe I can
I would
speak
say
to
it's harmful to society.
Totally. One thing I haven't touched on is maybe why we haven't really heard much about this. Like, why isn't there broader awareness about this? I could touch on that if you like.
Yeah, please. That would be very interesting, because, I mean, again, I had heard the term shadow banning, and I just never knew what it was.
Yeah, so in my case with Reddit, I thought this was going to be like a 2-week project that I would just share it online, and then everyone would find out, because I thought the truth would just naturally go viral. But what happened was moderators would often remove links to my site, so they didn't want oversight into their work. So and over time, I was researching like where I was allowed to post it, and discovered that on Reddit, the groups are called subreddits. So subreddits have rules about discussing content moderation. They call that meta discussion, or discussions about Reddit. And that topic is off limits. And certainly links to my site are often, but not always, but very often removed. I'm pretty sure a post about my site could make it to Reddit's homepage, but usually posts about my site are taken down within a few hours. On Reddit's homepage, I share some examples of what people say when they discover their shadow bans, which I find really fascinating. One user wrote, "Now that is interesting. How can they justify removing comments while making it appear to the user that comments are still there? Further, no reasons are given at all." Another user writes, oh my God, there was a thread where somebody insisted that the police in Europe had not been enforcing COVID restrictions using violence. I posted several videos and news articles showing otherwise, and no one ever replied to it. Now I know why. And then somebody else said, what's actually worse than astroturfing is how much censorship there is. Take your Reddit account, for example. XAmmo is a user he's talking to. And he says, about 25% of the comments you make are shadow banned. That means only you can see them and the world is none the wiser. All that time you spent typing out your insights only for them to be almost instantly hidden from the view of everyone else. So I wish more people knew, but I'm not permitted to directly message users about this. That's considered unsolicited messaging, and Reddit would ban me for it. I kind of agree with that because I don't want to receive unsolicited messages either. But it's frustrating that I can't land any posts about the site in any subreddits. They all have rules against it.
Yeah, that's absurd.
Yeah.
The rule against it, to me, is absolutely absurd and almost criminal. That you can't discuss content moderation that is happening on a platform that you're at.
Yeah, and that's all enforced by non-employees, as far as I can tell. I mean, all the users are anonymous, so I don't know who they are, but it's under the guise of not just platforms' private right to moderate, but under the guise of giving that power to all of us, as if we're self-moderating. But I don't think we are. I think it all bubbles up, and it gives the government cover to start censoring when enough people jump on board this ship.
Well, I'm just thinking, listening to you talk, I'm thinking about somebody that's a whistleblower.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people that are vital to transparency in our government, or in business for that matter. How easy it would be for the powers that be to just suppress their work. You go on and you make a post, well, like the police that you mentioned in Europe. I mean, whistleblowers and even journalists. I mean, are they being censored as well?
Oh, I don't know. I don't have the. I mean, I'm one person. I don't have the ability to track for that kind of thing. But I think what you're describing is completely within the realm of possibility. In fact, it would really shock me if it didn't happen to any degree. I think, yeah, if you were a whistleblower and you were shadow, you had your most important posts shadow removed, that really gives whoever doesn't like your messaging the jump on you, right? It gives them at least a day, if not a week or months, to sort of counterattack you before your attack is even initiated. If you can call it an attack. I mean, I think a whistleblower is just blowing the whistle. It's
Right.
But yeah, it really gives your kind of the existing power players a huge advantage. It's not just about keeping the message out. They know the message that you were going to send, and then they can get ahead of it.
Right. I mean, like in one of the comments that you read, the user was like, I posted about this factual information and no replies. And he had no idea that he had been shadow banned. He had just assumed that nobody cared. Nobody was interested in his, perceptions.
Yeah. And that was 3 comments. There are thousands of those. I mean, my site has only come up and been left up in sort of prominent positions on Reddit for a few hours at a time, like a handful of times over the last 6 years. And each time it is the subject of focus. There are just tons of these comments that come up, and I put some of them on my homepage, and other larger threads are linked in the FAQ. So it's just really shocking. And outside of Reddit, I can't say why the media hasn't taken up the topic. It wouldn't surprise me if news websites shadow banned their users in their comment sections. It would be nice to get some civil liberty groups involved, and I'm kind of in the process of doing that.
Oh, talk more about that, because that's something I'm very interested in.
I can't really tell who I'm speaking to because they haven't signed on yet. I went to a conference in DC last weekend called LibertyCon, where which is sponsored by oh shoot, now I'm going to forget the name of it. Students for Liberty, which is a libertarian organization, and met a bunch of groups there. And some of the reactions are actually a little bit surprising. Some are very excited to hear that that's a thing. They didn't know that you could build this kind of technology. They want to know how it works, like you did. But then others are like, oh yeah, I know that happens. And these are people standing behind the booths. These aren't just other attendees. So, I think it's sort of become ingrained in internet culture, or even outside of the internet, that this is somehow acceptable. Because again, you might feel compelled to shadow ban, one of your friends or family members just to kind of keep the peace. So I think it's important to take a step back and, kind of admit that, I might also want to do this. But when you look at the broader harms of it, when it happens at scale, we ought to be thinking, wait a second, how can we raise this as like a cultural issue to push back on it? Because it really is harmful.
Not that I have any hopes that this could happen, but what could we do or urge our legislators to do to combat this? What would you like to see the legislation propose?
So previously, when I've thought about this, I've been resistant to legislation because actually my first reaction when I built the site, right? I thought, I'm just going to build the technology and then share it, and everybody will know in 2 weeks, and then what happened. And then I thought, all right, well, that didn't work, but if I just keep adding features to the site and making it more popular, then eventually the media will tell a story about it. Well, that didn't happen. So then I thought, okay, if the media is not going to tell a story about it, then we need some, big guns, like the government should solve this problem. That was my first real strong reaction. We need the government support. So I'm listening to podcasts about misinformation and how people are talking about censorship and things like that. But then I started listening to more First Amendment speakers, like people from FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, and like former president of the ACLU, Nadine Strawson, who's speaks quite frequently about the First Amendment, and started to understand more about the risks of using government to solve problems. And I'm sure you're very familiar with that. This is all new to me. I wasn't particularly, I would say, politically in the know prior to, a few years ago starting this work. But one reason I've been resistant to legislation, I guess, is that I feel like we haven't tried the easier modes of attack. So far, no civil rights group has stood up to say that they don't support shadow banning. I think we could be building more tools like Reddit, running campaigns, teaching people about its harms, etc. I think that would be an easier thing for society to try first, rather than leaping to a government-led solution. But regarding potential legislation, I've slightly changed my stance on this to where I think I would support some legislation, just not the legislation that's currently being proposed. So I'm not a lawyer, but I could share my opinion on that if you like.
Yeah, please. Well, first off, what is being proposed right now?
Okay, so the legislation currently on the table that I'm familiar with comes from the states of Texas and Florida. Among other things, they require platforms to notify users when they remove content. The Texas law provides an exception for law enforcement. They wouldn't need to notify targets of takedowns. So Texas would only permit the government to shadow ban, and crucially, they wouldn't even need a warrant to do it. Up until now, I've said I wouldn't support government involvement in restricting platforms' right to shadow ban content. As I said, but recently I started looking more closely at the arguments being made in those cases about Texas and Florida, one of the questions before the Supreme Court, which is going to be heard, these two cases are going to be heard this term, involves whether the platforms have a First Amendment right to remove your content without telling you. And there's some legal precedent that says computer code is speech, which might seem to imply that shadow banning is protected on that basis. But so far as I can tell, that's not what NetChoice, which is a trade group representing a bunch of tech companies, is arguing in these cases. So NetChoice is opposing Florida and Texas legislation, which is trying to restrain the tech companies, right? So rather, NetChoice is arguing that all content moderation, even shadow bans, are expressive, meaning they send some kind of message. On the other side, those in favor of Texas, some argue that transparent content moderation, where the author of a post knows that it has been removed, is not expressive because the rest of the world can't see what was removed.
Right.
Okay, so maybe you would agree with them. I think of this as being similar to public court records. We might not be aware of every criminal violation out there, and so be ignorant as to what's legal and what's not, but we can at least look up the records when we need to. With transparent content moderation, we actually still cannot look up those records. So the question is that expressive? And maybe we differ on this, that's okay. I think right now, my thinking is that transparent content moderation is expressive, and that's based on my experience commenting online, learning the rules, and watching how people use my website, Reddit. If someone tells me my comment is removed, I understand that it was not permitted for some reason, and through trial and error, I can eventually figure out why. At that point, I'll either change my behavior or move to another forum. In other words, I got the message, right? But with a shadow ban, nobody gets the message about what was not permitted, not the authoring user, nor other users in the forum. And the result for the shadow banned users is they tend to remain in the same spaces and don't learn the rules. I would argue, as I said before, that's how these platforms have gotten so big and why they appear to be monopolies. We just don't realize we're being moderated. But in the upcoming court cases, some lawyers are arguing that shadow bans are expressive. They rely on a court case called Hurley, where the Supreme Court ruled that a private parade organizer could exclude an LGBT group from a St. Patrick's Day parade. The court's decision was based on the First Amendment. The justices said the message being expressed was the multifarious voices of other parade participants that were being expressed. And it was the, quote, choice of a speaker not to propound a particular point of view, and that choice is presumed to lie beyond the government's power to control, unquote. So, some NetChoice lawyers may argue that because a parade could exclude a group without saying why, and since the message was the other participants vis-a-vis multifarious voices, then so too should social media platforms be able to remove content without notification because the supposed message there comes from the remaining contextual comments that are still visible. However, where I would push back on that is in the case of the parade, the applicant who was denied knew that they were rejected, the LGBT group. That denial itself, to me, sends a message, even if the court did not think to mention that fact. I mean, who could have foreseen that secret removals, the shadow banning, would become such a huge factor in public communication? That's all to say, I think transparent content moderation is expressive, whereas shadow bans are not. But the legislation from Texas seems to want to stop all kinds of content moderation on the basis that today's platforms are common carriers. I'm not convinced, though, that Facebook, Google, Amazon are as permanent as we imagine. I think a little pinhole where society calls for mere notification of removed content to the author who wrote it could be enough to allow sufficient competition, but it would have to be a strong pushback. If we tried that and it didn't work, then I would support legislation requiring platforms to show users the view that moderators get of their own content. Users on Reddit should see the red background and their removed comments, just like moderators see. Same thing for YouTube comments, Facebook, on X, if you're de-amplified, you should know that, etc. So, yeah, go ahead.
So are they actually making the argument then that censorship is protected as a First Amendment right?
The platforms?
Yeah.
Yes, because they're saying it's like you're kicking somebody out of your house. They're not arguing for. I don't know if they have much to say in regards to sort of the government collusion that Schellenberger is focused on. But in regards to their own decision making, they certainly want to be able to moderate content. That was kind of their business plan, which is maybe granted by Section 230.
Yeah, to me, that just seems like an absurd argument that you have the right to censor someone else. So you're depriving someone else of their freedom of speech while claiming that it's your freedom of speech to do that.
Well, we should define censor here. Are you talking about censor as in shadow ban or censor as in?
Well, as in general, but I mean shadow banning in particular, where you're not even alerting the person that they've been censored, that they've been deplatformed or what have you.
Yeah, I think that's the worst form, and I certainly oppose the shadow banning. I think you could have a debate with reasonable minds over whether the platforms have a First Amendment right to transparently remove content. That gets into a discussion about Section 230, where C1 protects them from liability for user speech, and then this other part of it, C2, lets them remove whatever they want. I've heard very compelling arguments that say, well, those two things are in conflict with each other, because in C1, you're saying the platform is not the speaker is the user. And in subsection C2, you're saying the platform is the speaker. They can remove whatever they want. And that those are two different things. So.
Gee, I just don't even know what to say about this. It's just mind-boggling. Aside from legislation, I'm sorry, I'm still wrapping my head around these arguments. What can people do? What would you like to see people do? I mean, you mentioned there needs to be mass awareness. What can people do once they're aware that this is happening? Should they challenge the platforms directly? Should they abandon the platforms? What would you like to see people do?
Yeah, spread the word. You should be getting the same view of your own content that moderators get. It's on Reddit. You should see the red background. If you're de-amplified on Twitter, you should see that indicator. Focus on how content is getting removed, not what is getting removed. Definitely talk about it, reject its use. Look for platforms who say they will notify users of all moderation actions taken against them. As far as I know, nobody has made real transparency a priority. But I think if enough people spoke up about the more fundamental issue of how content gets removed rather than what gets removed, then more people will invest in that, because it will be what people want.
So your position is that and correct me if I'm wrong here. You support in general a platform's right to remove content. You just want transparency around that decision. Would that be a correct assumption?
Yes. I also find the arguments about the conflicts in Section 230 really, really compelling. I'm still reading about those. But yeah, I generally support transparent content moderation. And I don't think there's any justification for not notifying users when you've moderated them, and it may even come up in this court case about Texas and Florida.
What issues do you have with what are the issues that you have specifically with what Texas is proposing?
So Texas is kind of proposing that its common carrier requirements are narrowly tailored. But I think requiring mere notification would be more narrowly tailored, and that would make the Texas legislation look quite broad. They're asking for platforms to not do viewpoint discrimination, which is just not at all how the platforms currently operate. And if it's true that we're looking for the right solution and sort of a gradual approach, without, I don't know, destroying these companies that have been built up over time, then a smaller step in that direction would be to require notification for removals to eliminate the shadow ban. I think users have a right to know when they've been moderated, and there should be a high bar for making exceptions to a person's basic rights. Like, it shouldn't just be, even if the Texas law passes, it shouldn't just be a phone call from law enforcement telling platforms to shadow ban a target. If law enforcement wants to shadow ban somebody, they should be required to present a warrant.
Right.
And without that provision, the government would be the only ones who could shadow ban, and it would be easy for them to do it. And that could make things even worse than they are now. That's hard to imagine, but it's a possible future. Again, I am not a lawyer, but this is just my understanding of the issue.
But even that alone, just the fact that law enforcement can order a platform to shadow ban somebody or to remove content, to me seems dystopian. I mean, without a warrant, especially. I mean, that's just a dystopian nightmare.
Yeah, I think there are things that the executive branch can do that would surprise us. That they can make exceptions to our civil liberties. But I think warrants are the check on that, where you'd have to go to a judge and get permission. And the idea there being that if I'm going to suspend one person's civil liberties, it's to the benefit of a greater number of people's civil liberties. And if you have a right to know when you've been moderated online, all of our civil liberties are being violated tremendously, both our right to speak and our right to hear.
Right. And, as I mentioned in the monologue, it really begs the question, if we are being manipulated by, these online platforms, or if we're being manipulated in general by censorship, where we're only hearing approved narratives, then the decisions that we make as a society, can they really be, are they really our decisions? Because we're not making them with informed consent.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think they are. I think the administrative state is bloated, and all these, it seems like I'm reading a book about administrative law, and it seems to me that agencies are making all these regulations and interpreting their own rules and fining people and businesses without any consent, like you say, from the people. Law is called common law because it comes from the commoners. So yeah, I think this totally short circuits that. And you should be concerned even if you don't use social media, because your neighbors are.
Yeah. What do you think about the argument that these media platforms should be treated as public utilities? I'll give you an example. If I call you on the phone and I say something that's upsetting to the phone company or whomever, they can't shut my phone off because I've said something that they don't like, right? Why should social media platforms be able to similarly do that when they present themselves as a public forum?
I've heard Michael Schellenberger kind of make that argument, where I think he feels that today's social media are sort of like inherent monopolies, like they can't change. And this format that they have right now is just how they're always going to be. Maybe it's the technologist in me that wants to build something new, but I don't totally agree with that position. I think that they can evolve. We're just sort of stuck in this current position because they have some dark patterns that we're not familiar with and that we still need to teach each other about. So I don't know what would happen if you declare, like, the telecoms have been declared to be common carriers, public utilities, right? And they're still there. Like AT&T is still there. But what are the ramifications of declaring that, I don't know, Facebook and Twitter and Reddit are public utilities because they have some certain number of users, and then say they disappear one day? Does that make a mockery of how we classify companies as public utilities? I don't know. I haven't thought enough about it.
Yeah, it just, again, because it does seem concerning that these social media platforms have the power that they do to shape the discourse of not just our nation, but the entire world. And they seem to have no transparency, or there's certainly no accountability in place right now. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And I think we'll figure it out. I don't know how long it's going to take, but I think there is a solution out there.
What do you think the solution might be? Aside from just awareness.
Yeah, I really, like I said, I'm trying to approach digital rights groups, civil liberties groups about this, and to get them to sign up and to understand if they have any objections, what are the objections to opposing this practice publicly, to sign a statement about it. And I think if more of us were working in that direction, then we could really get the ball rolling. Now, maybe proposing legislation is part of that process.
I have very little hope that any legislation will come that will be beneficial, because the government itself is complicit in a lot of this, the censorship. I mean, would you agree with that as well?
Yeah, I can completely understand your feeling about that. Totally.
When do you think shadow banning really took off in terms of exploding? Was that during the pandemic, do you think?
I became aware of it in 2018. That's when I started to build the site. And I realized at that time that it had been going on because I had old comments on Reddit that I didn't know had been removed from like 4 or 5 years prior. I suspect that it really took off when social media took off. When was that? Like 2011, 2012. When like just some percentage of us were just online, such that became sort of the news all of a sudden, was on Twitter or Facebook. But it's hard to pinpoint. I was not working in that space. I've never worked for a social media company, so couldn't say precisely.
So would you say that governments are also heavily involved in shadow banning people on these platforms?
That's certainly what seems to be suggested by the Murthy versus Missouri court case, formerly known as Missouri versus Biden. I think shadow banning does come up in that case. They don't focus on it as much as they just focus on the communications between the government and platforms. But I think that the fact that so many of us have bought into this practice, and by the way, I don't consider myself immune from that. I just happened, like the way I came upon this was my own content was removed and I didn't know about it, and I was annoyed. But I could just as easily, say 10 years prior, have gone to work for one of these social media companies and just bought into the idea that this is what you're supposed to do, because platforms are allowed to remove content, and you can't do customer support for every person who's annoyed that their comment is taken down. That could have been me.
There should be a high bar for content removal. I
feel that way now. Yeah. But I guess I'm just trying to make the point that, so many of us have bought into this, that it's really hard to just say like, oh, it was the government who did this. Unless you want to go back to, like, I don't know, the 70s when the internet was just starting up, which was funded by the government, and suggests that it was some plan to control all of us. And I'll leave that to other commentators to opine about. It's too much for me to consider.
Yeah, well, there is a mechanism of control built into all of this.
Totally. Yep.
And I mean, you control the narrative, you control the people.
Yep.
And that's what I find most concerning about all of this.
I think that's true, but there's a big risk also when you are that controller of the narrative, because I'm a strong believer that the truth comes out eventually.
But can the truth come out when if it's being censored?
Eventually, yeah. I mean, look at the Soviet Union. There was a book written, I'm going to mispronounce his name, but by Solzhenitsyn, about what was going on in the Gulag Archipelago. All these dystopian prisons full of people who had just criticized the government, and then their neighbors were ratting them out secretly, and nobody knew what the rules were. They just had to all walk on eggshells all the time. But eventually that book did get out, and history does repeat itself, and but I think that we can discover those same solutions again to redress our own faults.
I mean, I have no doubt that the mainstream media is fully aware of what's going on with shadow banning, and the fact that they've remained silent and that this is not a big, uproar, to me is most concerning.
I don't know that they all know the scale. Somebody certainly knows. But I think that they don't acknowledge the harm, because I don't think that this benefits anyone. Like, if we're all so miseducated that we mess up, and like a pandemic, it's just, a bad virus gets loose and it, covers the world. And then we like knee jerk on this vaccine response and like require everybody to get it, and it has some bad side effects. If that's a result of us being poorly educated because our information flow is being so manipulated, I don't think anybody is safe in that environment. So I think if you take that viewpoint, it's not even good for the people who are in power. But that's just me.
No, that's an interesting perspective. Now, have there been instances where politicians have been shadow banned, that have been censored by these online platforms in the same way as someone like you and I would be?
I tried really hard to look for that. Whenever I see a politician talk on Reddit, I'll look up their account and see what was removed. And I think I found like one comment in Governor Schwarzenegger's history that was removed.
Really?
But he might have like reposted that comment, or like he was in touch with the mods, so he knew, or something. I never got any response back from him about the topic.
Interesting.
Most of the time, these politicians who participate on Reddit, which is the only one where I can really look up because that's what I built the tool for. Most of the time, they just have like a one-off account and they only comment in one post, and then they're never back. So they're not like commenting all over Reddit all the time, so that you would see their diverse post history.
Because a lot of I know a lot of Republicans have claimed that there's a bias on social media platforms that limits conservative voices, and have complained that they have been censored in many respects. And so I'm just curious if, and I want people to understand, this is not a partisan issue. Both parties have been complicit in this censorship regime. And it's not a Democrat versus Republican issue. It's almost a human rights issue at the very core. And again, censorship has never taken us and throughout world history in a direction that is anything but authoritarianism. It's very dangerous practice, and it needs to be a high bar. And Well, here, let me ask you this: are there any platforms that are out there that are setting a good example, that are good, is a good model in terms of transparency, in terms of doing this right?
So the founder of Stack Overflow, what is his name? Jeff Atwood. Jeff Atwood. He's a co-founder of Stack Overflow. He has a forum called Discourse,
Discourse, okay.
which is an open source, and his team openly says that they do not build this, shadow banning into their tool. They don't support it. Now there is a plugin for Discourse that lets you shadow ban your users if you install it. So there's always some chance that whatever platform you're on could start doing this without your knowledge. But I think if there were, and maybe I'm just being too optimistic or naive, but if there were broad cultural awareness about this, the harms of this practice, at least say among tech workers, then they would blow the whistle or say, no, we shouldn't do this. The same thing's going to happen to us as, happened to during the reporting on the censorship industrial complex. It's just going to, blow up in our face. Like, let's just start with the foundation of transparency.
So is decentralization a possible solution?
Okay, so I don't think so. I think even with decentralization, there's still some central source of truth, either the code or a server that tells you about other servers. And I gave the example of like Mighty Networks, which is a new forum that's not technically decentralized, but it's sort of allows you to make an easy installation yourself. But yeah, if I think if the shadow banned user happens to figure out what happens, then the forum administrator on a decentralized platform might simply say, oh, I didn't remove it. Your comment was reported. Say, for example, this shadow banning thing works based on user reports. So there's all this finger pointing where nobody really takes responsibility for this practice. So I think of it as a social media literacy problem. We just need to get enough people to understand, start pushing back on major platforms' use of it until it has less influence. I don't know that we'll ever get rid of it entirely. It's too hard to track. There's always going to be some sneaky forum somewhere that will always be doing it. But we could be educating each other about it, not picking up our pitchforks just because everyone else has a pitchfork. You know what I mean?
Have you considered, because again, right now RevEdit, your site, only deals with Reddit. Have you considered expanding that tool to encompass other social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter, or are there already tools out there that do that?
I would love to do that. I think, I would first check to see if there were any other tools. I haven't come across any for YouTube. I know Facebook is pretty aggressive about suing or threatening lawsuits over programmers who try to use their APIs in like unauthorized ways. So I would just approach it, hopefully after speaking with some lawyers or something. But again, that's what I'm sort of trying to do, is to connect with more groups about this, because it has been a little bit time consuming for me to keep pace with the changes on Reddit to keep my tool working.
Oh, I can imagine, because they change the APIs all the time, don't they?
They made one big change about a year ago, but there was another service that was sort of like backing up a lot of Reddit, and I could access that to get more content. And you kind of need to do that, otherwise there might be like a competing service that's using that, and more users would be drawn to that. But what I really wanted to show people was not other people's content that was getting removed, but hey, look at your own page, because it's easy to identify on Reddit. It's like very hierarchical. You've got reply after reply after reply in this like tree-like structure. So if one of the comments in the middle there is removed, you see removed. So you can see other people's stuff getting removed all the time. And you can go, for years, you could go and look up on another site to see that content. But it might never have occurred to you in that process to consider that your own comments were removed, because they don't say removed on them. That was certainly the case for me. And I'm a programmer. Like I just commented on Reddit for years without realizing that they had this shadow banning stuff.
What would you say the most common content type that you've seen? Is it political in nature? Is it social issues? What do you think is the most shadow banned category of content that you've
I
come
think
across?
what the platforms tend to use it for is what they call borderline content. It's something that's like within the rules, but sort of maybe pushing the boundaries. And that's their words, not mine, because I don't find any justification for shadow removing. But if you're just being a total jerk and not attempting to have any sort of conversation, I think generally the subreddits have plenty of tooling to ban you from the forum, so you know about it, right? But where they do this secret stuff is like maybe where they think, oh, I like this user, but I don't like this particular viewpoint that he's putting forth. So I'm just going to hide that, but I want them to stay and not cause trouble. So yeah, I'm just not going to tell them about that removal.
So again, I don't use Reddit that often. I mean, I visited the site to read different threads, but I've never signed up to actually interact with the platform. So these subreddits, are these, if I were to go to Reddit, for instance, and I set up a page for Crusade America, that would be a subreddit.
Yep.
And as a page creator, I would be able to do the shadow banning and moderation on my page. And does that apply elsewhere outside of Reddit, or is it isolated? So, for instance, if I were to ban someone from the Crusade America Reddit page, they wouldn't be banned from all of Reddit. They would just be banned from what would be called subreddit.
Yeah, that's right. They would just be banned from your subreddit. I actually set up a subreddit to show you how this works. You can go to reddit.com/r/can't say anything. And if you write any comment or post in that group, it will be shadow removed. So it will still show to you, and you won't receive a notification. But if you log out and look at it, or look at it using my site RevEdit, you'll find that it's been removed.
So I would be the one basically doing the shadow banning on Reddit then, if I were to, in the example that I gave with Crusade America. Or are people from Reddit doing the shadow banning as well, because it seems kind of decentralized in a certain sense with these. So
shadow banning, shadow banning. The word that academics use is like undisclosed content moderation, and I think we often think of banning as applying to like your whole account, but what I'm talking about here is a moderator can choose any one of your posts or comments and just shadow ban or shadow remove that. But yeah, if you shadow ban somebody from your forum, it only applies there, not elsewhere.
Interesting. Yeah, again, it's hard for me to imagine because I'm not like I said, I'm not that familiar with Reddit. I know that I assume that I've been shadow banned on platforms, given what you've said, given our conversation, and given the research that I've done for this show. But I certainly know that shadow banning exists across Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. I guess I just assumed that it was an isolated problem. And what I'm learning with talking to you is that this is a problem that affects pretty much everybody that's using these platforms.
I think that's true. And I thought it was isolated too. I'll just be honest with you. When I first found out about this, I went straight to a political forum, which was the Donald on Reddit. And, I found comments there from supporters of former President Trump, that were slightly critical of some of the policies, might have been critical of like a policy on immigration or the wall or something like that. And if it wasn't in line with what the moderators of the forum wanted, it would get removed. So that motivated me to build the site. But now I look at it and I see stuff across the spectrum getting removed. And I'm aware of reports from like sex workers who have also been pretty vocal about being shadow banned. So, it's on the left and the right, where there are, I think, loud voices about it. But those are two maybe extremes. The point I'm trying to get across is that it really impacts everybody. Yeah.
No, it absolutely does. And why should people care about this?
Yeah. So even if you don't use social media, the flow of information matters. When the government told people to use condoms to avoid AIDS, that put a huge dent in the AIDS crisis. It was significant. So social media is influential enough that it does impact our collective intelligence. Maybe you can think of it like the air quality. You might not hold bonfires in your front yard, but you're probably going to care if your upwind neighbor does. So you might not be on social media, but your neighbors, family, or friends probably are. And even if they're not, somebody in the next town or state is, and their decisions may impact you in some way. I think shadow banning has a big enough influence that you should care that it's happening. It wastes everybody's time while the platforms make money from our attention. Plus, it's in everybody's interest for our neighbors to be educated, and shadow banning does the exact opposite. It makes us dumber. Keep in mind that this kind of censorship is the worst kind of censorship. It's not just a simple removal, it's a removal you don't know about. So say, for example, you and I are having a debate on X. We're going back and forth. And I write, "Do you have a source for that claim, you idiot?" And then X decides I'm being hateful and automatically removes my post, but it doesn't tell either of us that. So from your perspective, I chose not to reply. But from my perspective, you never replied to my comment. That's miscommunication, and it happens every time someone is shadow banned. So instead of shadow banning, we should be rooting for a level playing field that informs, not disinforms, our neighbors.
I agree 100%. 100%. It must have taken a great amount of time and resources to create this website, Reddit. And you were just basically inspired to do this from your own experiences, correct?
Yeah, I would say the technical stuff didn't take too much time. I mean, I had to kind of relearn some JavaScript and then pick up this package called React. But that was beneficial to me because I was learning stuff along the way, and that makes me more marketable as a programmer. But the really challenging part has been to understand the history of the practice, and then also to try to speak out about it, because I don't have any background in persuasive writing or journalism or public speaking. So that's what I'm trying to pick up now.
Great. Well, I want to thank you for creating the website and for raising awareness of this issue, because again, I don't think a lot of people are fully aware of what's happening, and I hate to admit that I wasn't. I heard the word shadow banning, and I never looked into it. I didn't know what it was. I assumed that it was just, again, an isolated problem that affected certain types of misinformation that was considered dangerous. And again, I guess my problem, I mean, you and I disagree a little bit on terms of content moderation, where I'm more, again, a free speech absolutist, but we both agree that to just censor people and not inform them that they're being censored is just nefarious on its face. And it serves absolutely nobody's interest. Because again, as you're saying, the person that's being censored has no idea why they're being censored, that they're being censored, and what they can do to avoid being censored in the future. They're not learning anything. So who is gaining anything in this? Nobody is from my perspective.
Yeah, it's completely dystopian. It's like out of 1984. It has all kinds of harms. It presents a false consensus that leaves us unprepared for offline conversations. I think with transparent content moderation, forums, I think, compete on like a level playing field. People learn the rules and change their behavior or migrate to other forums. But the opposite is true with selectively applied shadow bans. People don't learn the rules. They're less likely to migrate, and therefore less likely to learn about other viewpoints and other ways of dealing with opposing viewpoints. So yeah, I think this turns neighbor against neighbor. It's in a far worse way than transparent content moderation would. I think we can have debates about whether transparent content moderation is a good idea or not, but I completely agree with you that shadow bans are completely unethical, and I don't think there's any justification for them.
Are there other types of shadow bans, or I guess that's a bad way of framing the question? Are there other types of content moderation that are similar to shadow bannings that are taking place as well?
Oh my gosh, Sean, there are so many different words for this same kind of thing, undisclosed content moderation, that can fall under the word shadow ban. I just use the word shadow ban because that's the word that is closest to public understanding.
Right.
But there's tons of euphemisms for this, going back to the 80s. It's called the twit bit. Tacky goes to Coventry. Visibility filtering is Twitter's. Selective invisibility. The list goes on. And they're not necessarily all operating in the same way. Twitter has like de-amplification. But yeah, I think you can put them all under the umbrella of either shadow moderation or undisclosed content moderation. And I think that is all unethical.
I would definitely agree with that. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to cover, that you would like to discuss? Any questions, any information that I had not asked?
I think it's been pretty comprehensive. Yeah, I really appreciate you having me on and giving me so much time to talk. I really enjoyed interacting with your producer offline and preparing for the show.
She's awesome.
She's great. So yeah, thank you so much for having me on, and yeah, good luck with your show.
Thank you, and good luck with your website. And can you go ahead and promote your website for us?
Sure. Yeah, so the website is revedit.com, and if you go there, you see a box where it asks you for your username. You can punch in your username and find out where you've been moderated if you use Reddit. If you don't use Reddit, and even if you don't use social media, you can go to removednews.com and read about the harms of this practice.
Talk about Remove News for a moment. I wasn't in.
Oh, so it's just a Substack newsletter. I've got just a handful of posts up there, so I'm not a prolific writer, but I try to write about pieces of this issue that are either newsworthy or that I think other people aren't saying. So like one post I have is kind of comparing this to what was going on during the heights of communism, and talking about that book written by Solzhenitsyn that was kind of smuggled out of the Soviet Union and is regarded as one of the components of bringing down that faulty administration. And then another post that talks about what platforms say is their justification for shadow banning users, where they claim it's about defeating bots, but that's not true. So I kind of walk through the arguments that I've seen other people make online, and try to educate people who either are being shadow banned or don't use social media.
So what's next for you after Revedit?
I don't know. I just moved back to the U.S. I was living in Taiwan for 10 years. I met my
really?
wife. Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, we could do a whole nother show on that. Yeah, I was traveling over there visiting a friend who lived in the region, and I met my wife in Taiwan.
Oh, wow.
And then I just kind of stayed there for year after year. It was I only planned to be there for a year or two, and then we were going to move back. But then, yeah, just you know, it's a very warm climate, and it's just so interesting to be in that challenging environment. You know, learning some Mandarin, and you know, the culture is a little bit different, but you know, people are very friendly, and yeah, I had a great time over there. So I've just moved back to the U.S. and just a few months ago, and next for me is hopefully landing a job either, you know, at some kind of rights organization, or you know, being a programmer doing freelance.
Great. Well, I've got some other podcasters that I'd like to, I think would be interested in having you on as well. That
Oh,
I'd
that'd be
like to reach
great.
out to, and I'll send you some links to some sites that you might, or some other shows that you might consider, because I think this is absolutely essential to get the word out and to get people aware of what is happening. And I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a lot of fun. I've learned a great deal. I'm a little outraged by this practice, learning
It's
more
good.
about
It's
it.
a righteous outrage.
Yes, righteous outrage. And again, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show, and I want to wish you the best of luck with your website and your future endeavors.
Thank you, Sean. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Me as well. And that's all for this week. We will see you next Tuesday. This has been Ku Save America.